Designing clean variable interfaces. Every Terraform module exposes an interface. That interface is not the resources. It is not the provider. It is not the cloud. It is the set of variables and outputs that allow identity to enter and leave the graph. A clean variable interface controls how identity flows inward. A messy one invites ambiguity. Today, we examine how to design variable boundaries that preserve meaning. A variable is not storage. It is not a configuration file. It is an input port. Terraform treats variables as the external origin of identity. Whatever value arrives through a variable becomes part of the dependency graph. Cause and effect follow from that decision. If the interface is vague, the graph becomes fragile. If the interface is precise, the graph becomes stable. Observe the variable name ID. Terraform accepts this. It sees a string, but meaning is missing. The resource depends on var.id, but what identity is flowing into the graph? Subnet ID, instance ID, security group ID? Terraform cannot infer intent. It only tracks references. The graph is technically valid. The interface is semantically weak. When a variable lacks meaning, humans compensate. They guess, they search, they rename mentally. That creates cognitive drift. Drift increases interface instability. Instability increases refactor risk. Terraform's graph remains correct, but the team's understanding decays. Clean interfaces reduce entropy. Now observe the difference. The variable name expresses intent. The resource depends on var.subnetID. Terraform still sees a string. The graph structure is identical, but identity meaning is preserved. The interface communicates constraint before execution. Nothing about provider behavior changed. Only the boundary clarity improved. The type argument is not decoration. It is a constraint on identity shape. Terraform evaluates type before planning resources. If the shape is wrong, the graph never forms. Cause precedes execution. A precise type prevents invalid identity from entering the graph. This is structural hygiene. Here, the variable requires a list of strings. Terraform now expects a collection identity. If a single string is passed, validation fails before dependency resolution. The graph only forms when identity shape matches expectation. The provider is not the focus. The interface boundary is. This fail-fast behavior prevents the graph from reaching a partial execution state. It avoids situations where infrastructure begins changing and then halts midway due to structural mismatch. Early structural rejection reduces wasted cycles and reduces unintended cost exposure from incomplete operations. A variable without a default requires external identity. A variable with default internalizes responsibility. That shifts control. Cause and effect again. If a module defines defaults casually, it silently asserts authority. If it requires input explicitly, it delegates authority outward. Clean interfaces make responsibility intentional. Terraform sees a default value. If no external value arrives, this identity flows inward automatically. No error, no prompt. The graph stabilizes around that default. This may be correct, or it may conceal an assumption. Defaults are not wrong, but they encode policy. Over defaulting can create invisible infrastructure decisions. Resources may be created at scale or a cost profile the caller did not consciously choose. That is how shadow infrastructure patterns emerge, not through malice, but through silent authority embedded in interfaces. A clean interface also protects visibility. Marking a variable as sensitive does not encrypt state. It alters display behavior. Terraform tracks lineage. If sensitive data flows forward, Terraform requires explicit confirmation at outputs. This preserves intentional exposure boundaries. Clean interfaces define not only what enters, but what is allowed to be seen. Variable interfaces also influence lifecycle stability. If a variable controls a resource argument that forces replacement, then interface changes can trigger destructive outcomes. The interface becomes part of resource identity. Therefore, renaming or restructuring variables in a published module is not cosmetic. It alters integration points. Clean design anticipates stability before publication. A clean interface is narrow. Expose only what must vary. Keep internal decisions internal. Each additional variable expands the identity surface area. More surface area increases coupling. Coupling increases refactor costs. A cockpit with 100 switches is harder to master than one with 10. Every variable is a switch you're asking your caller to understand. Minimal exposure improves graph resilience. Terraform enforces structure. You enforce meaning. Variables are not convenience parameters. They are identity gateways. Design them with clarity. Constrain them with types. Assign defaults deliberately. Mark sensitivity intentionally. Because Terraform will faithfully build whatever boundary you define. The quality of the graph depends on the quality of its entry points. Clean interfaces produce stable systems.